doing this thing. Tighten that up. Gary's shirt. It's an excellent shirt. Critters arrived. Lady designs the shirts. Have an excellent pizza. What is it? Star Destroyer shirt?
Yeah, Gary's wife. Okay. Let's do air school.
If she's gonna stay there, then I can shoot from this. Getting the panel photo ready? Nope, they didn't stay. Okay, I'll stay here.
Welcome everybody to this gorgeous Saturday afternoon at Silicon Valley Comic-Con. How's everybody doing so far?
That's not very good.
That was incredibly anemic. It's like you like it when I say this part. You are about to see three of the best and brightest minds in science fiction of this generation to offer. Let's try that again. Who is excited for this panel? Thank you.
This mic is not hot.
Alright, here I go. Alright, this is a happy thing.
Toast. Okay, mine's hot, but hers is still off.
Yeah. Oh, yours is still off?
Yep.
Oh, man. Did you touch the...
Yeah. Maybe say something.
Hello? Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, it's just the LED doesn't work, but you can do that.
Yeah, I know, that didn't work, but it still works.
It works.
Yeah.
Okay, we're good. Thank you.
Alright, good. Alright, someone help us out. I'll be back if you need anything.
How's everyone doing? That was weak. Oh no, there's going to be lots of judgment. Do you want me to start or wait for people to fill in?
Let's try this again.
I checked my phone.
I like how quiet he comes up and whispers stuff to us in front of the hot mics. And remember, these people are morons. You have to talk down to them. It's okay though.
I can now say that I have officially been thrown under the bus by Andy Weir. Achievement unlocked? Question mark?
All right, my watch says 3 o'clock. Let's get started. All right, so the title of this panel is From the Pages to the Screen, and that's literally all they sent me. So what I assume that panel to be about is the art and craft of taking comics and novels and written material and turning it into movies and TV shows and things on your screens. Andy Weir, let's start with Andy Weir. Andy Weir is an author and software engineer best known for writing The Martian, which which he self-published before it went on to become a worldwide bestseller. So all those out there thinking of self-publishing your books, it can be done.
It works out every time.
It works out every single time.
Without exception.
And of course a movie starring Matt Damon and directed by Ridley Scott. So he's done the page-to-screen journey in a way that many of us can only envy and imagine. And his most recent novel, Artemis, is currently in development at 20th Century Fox. That's been written by my friend at Lindsey's, the great Geneva Robertson. And Andy, I'm presuming a third book is on the way? A little tidbit? You going to give us something?
Not talking about the plot of my new book yet, but I'm plugging away on the first draft. Hope to have it in bookstores mid-2020.
Okay, cool. Lindsey Weir is one of the most sought-after screenwriters in Hollywood right now. And she specialized in the very subject of this panel, bringing the page to the screen. She's currently adapting Martin Millar's The Magic Order as a TV series for Netflix. She's also worked on adapting Patrick Rothfuss's The Kingkiller Chronicles, as well as franchises like Godzilla, Transformers, and Star Trek. And not just any Star Trek, the Quentin Tarantino batshit Star Trek. Honestly, and many, many other things. She created Sarah Burgess as a Loser on Netflix. And honestly, we could spend the whole panel reading her bio, but let's not do that. She's done so many cool things. So these are two great panelists to have for a conversation title from the page to the screen, because we have both perspectives. Andy is the author who works on the page and sees his work translated to the screen, and Lindsey, for whom a big part of her job as a screenwriter is adapting those works that start on the page to the screen. So I just want to start, before we get into the specifics, I just want to start out by asking you both how you got started as a writer. Andy, you came from a tech background. Your father was an accelerator physicist, and your mother was an electrical engineer. And you started your career as a computer programmer at a young age. You worked at places like AOL and Blizzard. So the career you have now as an author kind of feels like a hard left turn from that. How did that transition happen?
Well, I just kind of stumbled into it. I always wanted to be an author, like even when I was a teenager. But when the time came to choose a major in college, I was like, well, I could go into lit or I could go for software engineering. And I decided I really like regular meals, so I went into software. But I always wanted to be a writer, and so I was always writing and stuff. The Martian was just a passion project that I was posting to my website a chapter at a time, and I just feel like I bungled into success, and I kind of wish I knew exactly what I did right. I don't know, but so that's kind of my story. But before we go further, I feel like you didn't really tell them much about you, Gary.
Oh, shit. It's not about me. I'm just the moderator. I'm Gary Whitta. I'm the co-writer of Rogue One, A Star Wars Story.
Yeah. So like, that's the sort of thing they like to know.
The Book of Eli and Star Wars Rebels and all kinds of other stuff.
But what are your dreams, Gary?
This is it. I mean, what could be better than being on this panel with you fine people and lovely people in front of us? Andy, what I think is really cool is you were able to parlay a lot of your science and tech knowledge into writing The Martian. I think the cool thing about The Martian is how the science really helps tell the story.
Yeah, thanks. One of the hardest things, for me anyway, in writing science fiction or anything is where you have some MacGuffin or whatever, you come up with the rules of this world that you're in, that your story takes place in, and everything has to be internally consistent, or at least you need to kind of make the reader look away from the places where it isn't internally consistent. So I found that just using real physics is very good at being internally consistent. The universe is very good at following its own rules.
Lindsey, what about you? You went to school up here in Stanford.
I did.
And you studied neuroscience. Again, how does that all wind up with you becoming a writer?
Just trying to find a way to epically disappoint my parents. And it worked out. I actually always wanted to be a science fiction novelist and a director. I didn't know that screenwriting was a thing because we're kind of invisible mole people. And then it just kind of worked out that I started writing a novel. And I had about a year's worth of money to live off of, and I realized after writing the first chapter that it was going to take a lot longer than a year, and screenwriting seemed like a better option, and that's kind of how I stumbled into it.
So Andy, in broad strokes, I'm sure you've told this story a million times before, but I'm sure many here haven't heard it. Take us through the page-to-screen process with the Martian. First of all, did you ever envision it, even in just your imagination, as you were writing the book, that it's something that could one day be a movie?
No, I never thought it would actually become a movie or anything. At the time I wrote it, I thought, in fact, not just thought, but I was writing it for a tiny niche audience of regular readers that I had on my website, hardcore science dorks who wanted to actually see the math laid out in the text. So it never occurred to me it would have any mainstream appeal at all. And then I was really surprised when a publisher wanted to print it, because I'm like, again, I thought my audience was like 0.0001% of available reader market, you know. But, you know, it did really well, and then Fox bought the rights, and, you know, everyone told me don't get too excited. You know, movie studios buy the film rights for any book that's doing well. They don't necessarily make the movie. In fact, they usually don't. But then they just kept plugging along, and they kept moving forward. In terms of the book to screenplay, that was done by Drew Goddard, who originally wanted to write the screenplay and direct the film. He wrote a great screenplay, and then he left the project to go to Sony to work on a Spider-Man film. And so we went, and that was right around the same time also that we cast Matt Damon. So I say we, like I did anything. When you're the author of a novel in the movie making process, everyone always says, "Oh, what'd you do on the movie? What do you have to do with the movie?" Your only job is to cash the check. That's it. You have no authority. You have no say. I mean, if you're a huge name like J.K. Rowling or Stephen King or something like that, then you can start getting some creative control. But not when you're Andy Weir. So they got Matt Damon to play the lead. So we went from director with no lead to having a lead and no director, and then they got Ridley Scott to direct. So everything really steamrolled from there. But the adaptation part, the part we're here, I guess, to talk about today, really was all Drew. Drew Goddard did a fantastic job on the screenplay adaptation. He got rid of the parts that could be pulled out of the story to make room, and the things he chose were exactly what I would have chosen if it had been up to me, which it wasn't. And also, what's funny is, so that line, "I'm going to science the shit out of this," that everybody knows from The Martian, that's just in the film. That's nowhere in the book. I never wrote that line. That's all Drew. And people always give me credit for it, and I always correct them. I'm like, and they're like, "Oh, Andy, I love that line. I'm going to science the shit out of it." I'm like, "Great, you should tell Drew Goddard, who wrote that line, how much you like it." So I've had people in autograph lines say, "Hey, write this on the book." I'm like, "Okay, but you should know." Anyway.
So when Hollywood starts knocking, what was important to you in terms of the adaptation? Were you worried that Hollywood was going to? It's a very hard science book. Were you worried it was going to get dumbed down?
Well, I'm curious what she was about to ask.
I was actually just going to ask something that was exactly related to that. I was going to ask if there was anything science-wise that was changed or cut out that really annoyed you to movie-fy it.
I'm gonna say no. I mean, there was a lot of, basically what they did was they got rid of a lot of the detail, but they kept the correct answers there, but they got rid of the explanations for how Mark gets from here to there. There was a whole sequence in the book where he has to figure out that he's in a dust storm event, where he's like, where the amount of solar energy that can get to his solar panels is going down and down, but very gradually. And he needs to figure that out and figure out where the center of the storm is. And I thought that was a cool little scientific puzzle. Whole thing got cut.
So Lindsey, from a screenwriter's perspective, the reality for working writers in Hollywood these days is adapting other people's work, be it comics or novels or any kind of existing IP, is like 80% of the work that's out there. So it's become a very important and particular writing skill set that we as screenwriters have to have. We all break in with original material of our own, but then we're immediately set to task adapting other people's stories. And I think that's part of the risk-averse culture in Hollywood, where big movies need to be based on an existing IP for executives to feel comfortable spending millions of dollars on them. But how do you approach it creatively? Are you able to approach adapting someone else's work with as much passion as you would your own original story?
Definitely with enough passion. You know, I don't take something on unless I'm super passionate about it. And you know, one of the things that I've been blessed with is being able to redo things that I was obsessed with as a child and growing up, and so that passion was always there. But in terms of how I approach it, I just kind of look at what's the essence of the story. And I think that, you know, rather than thinking about how do you dumb it down for a movie, you have to approach it as what's the purest form of this book? What's the theme? What are the characters really trying to say? And telling that story from the character perspective. And if I can't get into that arc, then I don't take it on.
I've got a question for her. Like I've written some screenplay stuff, but I have extremely limited experience. I'm curious about, so when you find yourself working on a project that isn't like a direct adaptation of a book, but like, so for instance, the Tarantino Star Trek thing.
Yeah.
How much like free reign do you have? Are you just, it's up to you, you get to write the story, or does he, are there other people saying, we want this to happen, we want that to happen?
It's completely different in every situation. For that specific one, it was two writers and I and Tarantino in a room, and he said, "So, what are your ideas for an R-rated Star Trek story?" And we started pitching him, and he just kind of listens, and he said, "Okay, so anyway, I was thinking." And he pitches, and I'm not even kidding. He pitches what I think was a 40-minute version of a film with like accents and everything, and we're just kind of staring at him like, "Okay, well, why didn't you lead with that?" But it was amazing. He had so many amazing ideas, and we kind of built from there.
So, how much screen time is dedicated to his foot fetish? Just curious. Yeah, 0, really? I'm looking forward to seeing it. There's going to be feet.
It's actually really amazing. What I was surprised at was how much of a Trekkie he was, and how much knowledge he really had about the canon. I was really, really impressed. And so even though I think it feels like a filmmaker-driven, very specific version of a Star Trek film, it still feels like the essence of a Star Trek.
I'm looking forward to it.
Andy, one thing that people often misunderstand is the idea that authors have a lot of control over how their work is adapted. That's actually true in very, very rare cases. Like in the case of like mega-selling authors like J.K. Rowling and E.L. James, where they actually were able to get the movie made on their terms because they're in a position of such power as of holding the underlying rights to something that is the license for the studio to make millions. So they kind of have to do it on her terms. But for most authors, for us mere mortals, they often have to surrender a lot of creative control to get a movie made. So I want to ask you, how did you come to terms with that? And were there things that you felt you were able to put your foot down about if it came to that?
Well, I certainly never, I could put my foot down as much as I wanted, but they didn't have to care, I'm just like in the corner stamping my little foot. But they chose to include me in a lot of the creative decisions and just, I was there in an advisory capacity only, and I knew that. And I think I'm pretty good at working with people on projects. I was a software engineer, always part of a team for a long time, so I kind of learned that work ethic for quite a while. So I'm good at not flying off the handle, I think. But there were a few things that I just kept bringing up stubbornly until they kind of gave up. Like one thing is, Ridley is he comes from a production design background. He comes from he loves the visuals. He's all about the visuals. And he's like, you know what, I was at Cape Canaveral, and it's absolutely gorgeous. I want that outside the windows during the mission control scenes. And we're like, mission control is in Houston. It's not in Florida. And he's like, yeah, but it looks really good. And I'm like, it's like one of the few things that literally everyone knows. Houston, we have a problem. It's not Tallahassee, we have a problem. Right? And so, I just kept pestering him on it until he gave up. So, but that was one. But for the most part, my role there was just as a technical advisor. They'd say, oh, can we show this thing? And I'd be like, well, that wouldn't work with physics. And then they'd be like, oh, okay, we'll change it. So they had already decided they wanted to be scientifically accurate in the movie, and they used me as a resource to help them with that. But in terms of creative stuff, they mostly didn't need my help.
It really works. It could easily have been with other filmmakers. Could easily have been Armageddon on Mars, right?
Yeah, no. There's a lot of ways it could have gone bad, and it didn't, and I'm really happy.
It's funny, I actually moderated a panel in this room yesterday with some NASA scientists, and it was about science and science fiction, and part of the discussion was what irritates NASA scientists when they see movies about science and space, because there's always inaccuracies. And I think the thing that occurs to me, if I worked at NASA, the thing that would irritate me the most is the Hollywood version. This goes back to what you were saying. The Hollywood version of NASA looks so much nicer than the real NASA. If I worked at NASA, I'd be like, why did Jeff Daniels' office looks amazing? Why does my office look like a piece of shit? Yeah. Because it's this everything in real life NASA is like government beige, But when Hollywood production designers come along, they make it look much nicer than it actually is.
Yeah, we got that feedback from NASA people. They said, and also especially JPL. JPL is, just off. It's a nice facility, but it's nothing near as awesome as it's shown in the film. And one of the biggest things I got from people at NASA and JPL was they said the movie shows an unrealistically cooperative relationship between NASA and JPL.
Lindsey, what are you looking for when your agent sends you something for consideration to adapt, or if you just happen to be reading a novel or a comic book? How do you know? Do you have like a spidey sense for when something's going to make a good movie or a TV show?
I don't think anybody really has that. I know a very big producer, director who passed on Harry Potter, but I think for me, I'm always looking for something that either makes me laugh and cry, or just something that looks wildly different than anything that I've seen on TV or film, and that to me makes it worth taking on.
And you've now reached a point in your career as an author where anything you write is going to get immediate attention from Hollywood. Perhaps even before you write it, it's like whatever you're writing next, we want in, because obviously you've had a huge hit book and a huge hit movie. But aside from the truckload of cash that you quite correctly mentioned earlier, what do you like going forward? What do you want to see or hear from someone? If you're sitting down with a screenwriter or a director or a producer, what do you want to see or hear from someone who approaches you looking to adapt your work? Like, what would make you feel comfortable in terms of this is the right guy for the job?
Well, first off, that whole thing where they'll buy anything I write, that has an expiration date, right? Like if my next few novels are crap, that's going to end, right? You're only as good as your last book. I've always said that, if you give someone a book, you entertain them for a night. If you teach someone to write, you give them crippling self-doubt for life. But in terms of what I want, as a good example would be with Geneva, who's a good friend of yours, who is writing the adaptation for Artemis right now, and it's an example of how I like to see things go. Is that she read the book and she zeroed in on the things that were important, like basically saying okay, these are the themes that are the core of the story. These are the characters that are critical, and just knowing what to condense, what can go away, what has to stay, and of course, a whole bunch of intangibles that I'm just not educated on because I'm not a screenwriter, on how to convey the story in a visual medium instead of a book medium, how to get the exposition in all through narration and stuff like that. But the main thing is that I want to see, what I hope for is the person writing the screenplay agrees with me on what the major themes are and what the principal plot line is. I think that's probably what any writer wants. Of course, what we all want is I want it to look exactly the way it looked in my brain when I was writing it, but that's never going to happen. And so you have to just kind of realize that you're one part of a large process. You're no longer the dictator that you were when you were writing the book.
That's true of any fandom, right?
Yeah.
It's true of anybody who reads the books too. You want it to look exactly how you envisioned it, and it's hard with adaptations, and even harder when it's your own.
Yeah, and much harder when it's your own, because you feel a tremendous ownership. If you're a fan of a book and then other people make it into a movie, you can be like, oh, that's not how I imagined it, but you don't really have a leg to stand on. You're just, somebody there. But if it's your book,
And screenwriters experience that too if they're not the directors of their own film.
Yeah, same thing.
That's not how I saw that scene playing out.
and even directors run into it when the editors make a much better cut that the studio likes better. Shit rolls downhill.
So following on from that, this one's actually, I'd like to hear from both of you on this. It feels like, I think authors often want to feel like the movie is going to be very faithful adaptation, but the truth is oftentimes a super faithful adaptation is not the best way to adapt something. Sometimes you've got to weigh and kind of reinvent. Though just doing a very fidelitous kind of page-by-page adaptation doesn't necessarily make the best version of the movie or the show. So from Andy's point of view, do you, if someone comes, if Geneva or someone said, this is not going to be faithful, I'm going to go off and do what's Lights of the Wild Crab, it's going to capture the spirit of the book? Do you feel, does that make you uncomfortable, or are you comfortable with that?
I'm comfortable with that because it's a different medium. You can't just, something that makes a fantastic book doesn't necessarily make a good movie. And I think the canonical example of that is The Great Gatsby. Like, it is indisputably a wonderful book, and no one has ever made a really successful film adaptation of it.
And do you think that's because they always want to be too faithful to it?
What's that?
Do you think that's because they always want to be too faithful to it?
I don't know. I don't have. I bet you could do it. I bet you could do it. Yeah, but I don't have any. I don't know why it doesn't come across into film very well, despite the very talented people who have worked on them, on the various adaptations. But for some reason, that story is just a story that works well in print, but not as well in the visual medium. And it's a huge challenge that I have no idea how you do them, is to figure out, okay, here's the story, and I need to make it work in a film.
Well, I often actually find that the better written the book, the more beautiful the book, it's often even harder to adapt it. And the nuance of it doesn't translate as well to film.
Especially also, like, one of my favorite authors is Terry Pratchett, and the most entertaining parts of his book are the narration. Like,
so the footnotes and all that cool
Yeah,
stuff.
the footnotes are great. And how do you do that in a film? I mean, you can have a narrator, but that just starts to get annoying after a while as a viewer of a movie. So it would be really hard to, I mean, Sky TV has turned a few of his books into like made-for-TV movies that are fairly entertaining, but it's just not the same, you don't get that same feeling that you get when you're reading it.
Lindsey, when you were just talking about the more beautiful the book, the tougher it is, I feel like you were maybe referencing King Killer there, because the prose is what is so much of what makes that book amazing, but that's something that doesn't translate to the screen necessarily.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a book that is a huge challenge to translate well. It's the kind of thing where if you were to do it scene by scene, it would, that's 4 films in and of itself, without a clear narrative drive that a film requires. But it's not just King Killer. I'm producing an adaptation of Lord of the Flies. There's never been, I think, a perfect adaptation of that. It's a classic film. And I think it's, Great Gatsby is another great example. To me, I think it's certainly not just amazing.
So when you go in and pitch on a movie or a TV adaptation, do you often find yourself saying, look, you can do this, but like we're going to have to change a whole lot of stuff for it to work?
Yeah, and that's often a difficult conversation when it comes time to speak to an author about it, and some are more open-minded. Andy obviously sounds incredibly grounded about it and understands how it works, but it's hard. You put your life and soul into something, and it's yours, and you have it, and it's kind of it's perfect as it lives on the page, and then to see somebody else kind of run with it in a way that feels like it might be shortchanging it because it's simplifying it I think is hard for a lot of authors.
Yeah, in my experience, I mean, I've adapted a bunch of books and comics and authors. I always like to talk to the author, because if I were the author, I'd want the screenwriter to come talk to me.
Yeah.
And you go to them, and they always say, "Oh yeah, of course. Do what I understand. You've got to change things. Do whatever you need to do." And that's great until you actually start changing things.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's true. It's hard. When I adapt something, I try to read the book. I step back. I don't take notes when I read the book. I just want to think about, okay, what is the actual essence of the story? What are the plot points that I remember? Not because I wrote them down, but because they stood out. What are the character moments that just stood out to me? And then to me, that becomes kind of the essence of the book that I kind of create the themes around. And I think about, what does the movie mean to me? What does the movie version mean to me? And then I sit down with the author and make sure that it exactly what it means to them. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then we get on the same page, because I personally never feel comfortable bringing something to life if it doesn't make the author happy, because I know as a writer it would break my heart if somebody ran with something that was so special to me in a way that I didn't validate. So it's important to me to have the buy-in of the person who created the original material.
And you just go back to The Martian. Just, you mentioned Drew Goddard, the screenwriter, who is a terrific writer and really nailed I think they said he nailed it pretty much on the first draft. Right? Everyone was so surprised that he got it right away.
Yeah, there were not. I mean, the version you saw on screen wasn't very different from the first draft, or the first delivery, I guess I'd say. I'm sure he went through a bunch of revisions on his own, but yeah, just a few like notes and stuff back and forth, and I wasn't involved in all of those notes meetings, of course, but it didn't change much. So I guess he just did a really good job, or maybe the story is just one of those stories that lends itself well to screen, you know.
So, I mean, just talk a little bit about the process. Was it collaborative in any way, or did he just go away and write?
No, he was on the phone with me almost every day.
Oh, wow.
But almost always with technical questions. It's not like he needed my creative assistance. It's like, you know, he just like, he really wanted to understand, you know, it's because all the problems that Mark runs into are like kind of scientific, right? And so he's like, I really want to understand what this is, so explain it to me, you know, walk me through it, or I want to understand what that is, walk me through it, you know, stuff like that. And then later on, when he started getting notes from the studio and from Ridley, he said like, okay, they want a scene where, you know, they do this thing instead of that thing. They want to do this thing, like in the book, for instance, he doesn't do the Iron Man thing that he does at the end of the movie. And they said like, well, can we do that? And I'm like, well, not really accurately, but sure. You know, he would ask my advice on the science end of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's awesome. we talked about it on the NASA panel yesterday. I said, like, we talked about the Martian. I said, yeah, let's attack Andy for a minute here.
Yeah.
What you know, is there anything in even the Martian, which most people correctly hold up as one of the more scientifically accurate movies? Okay, I've got some NASA guys here, like, what's not accurate? And it's funny, I said to Andy, hey, some NASA guys told me what was wrong with your movie, and he went, the windstorm, right? You instantly knew.
Yeah.
Because the reality is there's not that much air on Mars, and so the windstorm that would have put Mark Watney in that trouble in the first place actually is not possible. But
right.
Without the windstorm, he doesn't get stranded, there's no movie.
Right.
Right? So there's that, sometimes you've got to sacrifice a little bit of scientific accuracy so you can tell a story.
Yeah, I had to do that. I feel dirty. Basically, what's funny is since the book came out, I mean, I knew at the time that I wrote it that was inaccurate to physics, but I had considered an alternate thing where they're doing an MAV engine test and something goes awry and that forces the situation to happen. But it's a person versus nature story, and I wanted nature to get the first punch. So that's why I liked the storm idea, and I just said, well, this isn't accurate, but however, since then, after the Martian did really well, New York Times bestseller, I got to go to NASA and stuff like that. I learned that Mars has lightning. So things can get struck by lightning on Mars. I didn't know that. I didn't realize that. And so if I had it to do over, I would have something get struck by lightning, and that's the inciting event, maybe causes an explosion, makes the MAV start to tip, whatever. But
Talking about a sequel.
yeah, a sequel. No, this is the era of reboots. It's been what, 4 years since The Martian came out. It's time for the remake. Yeah. But yeah, calm. But I'll set up a meeting. Yeah. But so when they were making the film, I knew all this, and I said like, hey guys, you know, if you guys are, I see you're putting a lot of effort into scientific accuracy. You have an opportunity here to be even more accurate than the book was. We could have a different inciting event for the thing. And Ridley's like, no, dust storms look awesome. All right.
Lindsey, from the point of view of the adapter, how much contact or collaboration do you ideally like to have with the author whose work you're adapting? I imagine it can be different in each case depending on the work and the author.
Yeah, for me, it hasn't been something that I've dictated. It's been more kind of at the discretion of the author. People like Mark Millar and Pat Rothfuss have been incredibly involved in every draft and notes meetings and, you know, calls informing character and plot decisions. And then you've got somebody like Patrick Ness who wasn't at all involved in Chaos Walking when I was working on it. So it really just depends. But Patrick Ness did write some drafts, and I know did give notes to the studio at some point, but I never had contact with him.
And sorry, Andy, I just wanted, there was a part about the Drew Goddard conversation that I forgot to ask. I want to go back to it though. You said that Drew hit you up with a lot of technical questions, but did you have like a more holistic kickoff conversation where he called you and said, okay, this is how I'm going to approach it, what do you think, is this cool with you, I might change this or that?
No, really. He just said, I'm going to get to work on the screenplay. I'm like, cool. look forward to seeing it. Well, when I'm doing notes, like, so for instance, right now, doing that with Geneva, as she writes drafts, I you know, when the production, whatever, when the company decides that they want to give me the draft, it's not like Geneva doesn't send it to me. She sends it to the, you know, to the directors and to the, you know, the production company, and then they sometimes will say, well, now let's get Andy's take. And so it's like, I'll see oh, this draft is dated like 3 months ago. Okay, well, whatever. And I'll write up notes, and then I'll just email them back and to the company, and they can choose whatever they want to tell Geneva. So it's not like super direct, but they just send it straight along to her. And I also am a firm believer in general of if you're going to complain about something, you need to provide a solution. So a solution that you think might work. So every one of my notes has a suggestion like, here, I think this doesn't work because blah, here's a way that you could solve it. That's kind of, I try to be purely a tone of suggestion.
And I think there's a good take in that process where, you know, if something was dated 3 months ago, it's not because they didn't care about your input, it's like the opposite. There's a certain amount of wanting to get things right, or that you could put it in front of the author.
Maybe. I don't think I'm deeply important.
No, but you know, they want to make sure it's in a good enough space where it honors the special material.
I'm going to have a couple more questions for Andy and Lindsey, but I think we will have a little bit of time for Q&A. So if anyone wants to step up to the mic with a question, now would be the time to reserve your spot. Okay, so Lindsey, right now you are working on adapting Hello Kitty into a movie. Where do you start with something like that?
So will there be a Deadpool cameo?
I start with the rich mythology that was already.
Well, so sometimes I get sent this stuff all the time, and some, not to Hello Kitty specifically, but things like that. And
also Hello Kitty.
And
I just get submitted everything.
Just all the cool Sanrio stuff. So sometimes when I get sent something like that, I find it a bit off-putting because there's no real narrative foundation. But other times, I think I actually find that liberating because you can start with a blank slate and it can be anything, right?
Yeah, you know, I love doing adaptations like that because I think people think it can be a little bit overwhelming, and it is. But when you have a big brand, whether it's Hello Kitty or a Lego movie, that in and of itself kind of gets butts into seats, and it allows sometimes studios to take a little bit more of a risk on a more edgy or different style of film that you haven't seen before.
Edgy Hello Kitty.
A little edgy, but by edgy I mean something that is something that we haven't quite seen before. You know, like Lego was very astructural and whimsical and wild in a way that people hadn't seen quite from an animated movie in a long time. And so I like opportunities like that where you can kind of hang your hat on the brand and then kind of find the theme, or, you know, find the theme and build the story around it.
So that's something we didn't even touch on. We've talked mainly about collaborating with authors, but you know, our mutual friend Nicole Perlman, who co-wrote Detective Pikachu, told me a lot of stories about how it was often very difficult working with the Pokemon company in Japan because there are cultural differences and they're very specific about things you can and cannot use.
Yes.
That's often the real headache, right?
Oh yeah, and it can be the headache and also the delay. Can we close that?
Can we close that door, please? Thank you very much. You were saying?
Somebody's very angry.
Yes, me.
Oh. So it's interesting.
Hello Kitty.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Sorry, what was the question?
Working on an adaptation when there's like a big company that has very specific do's and don'ts.
I remember what I was saying. It can be very, I think, you know, you have to just think about it the right way. For me, I've been very delighted about the culturally specific notes. I've found them very amusing and very just kind of insightful about the culture, and it's been a lovely learning experience so far. Ask me again in 3 months. So far, I've really enjoyed it.
So just on a general note, before we go to Q&A, because I see we have a bunch of people lined up, at panels like these, we often get people who are interested in breaking into screenwriting or writing themselves. As someone who has broken in and been very successful, what's one piece of advice you'd give to others getting started? Give me one piece of creative advice and one piece of practical advice. What's something you know now that you wish you knew back then?
Which one of us should go first?
Let's start with Lindsey.
Well, I wish that I knew how hard it was on all levels, and how few people become successful, and even when you are successful, how, there's kind of, you have to keep proving yourself over and over again. And as Andy said, you're only as good as your last book, you're only as good as your last movie, and so, to do this for a living, you really, really have to love it and not be in it for success, not be in it for credit, not be in it for money, be in it for pure passion. And I would say that my advice across the board for both issues that you asked about kind of comes down to passion. If people say write what you know, I don't think you should write what you know. You should write what you're so passionate about that you're like driving somewhere and you forgot how you got there because you were thinking about the story and you're like, holy shit, that wasn't safe.
Were there stoplights back there? I don't even know.
And on the practical side, I would say find people early on who are as passionate about you as you are about writing. And I was lucky to find two such people early on. One is my agent, who is still my agent, and he's actually here today. And another was my best friend from childhood, who was an assistant at WME at the same time I was starting to write, and he was somebody who was very instrumental in kind of like, telling people, you have to read this girl's script. So, find people who believe in you as much as you believe in yourself. And don't focus on, like the huge, shiny agent, head of the company, whatever. Find people that you can rise with who are kind of at your own level, because those are the people who have an incentive to help you and help each other.
So Andy, same question to you from the perspective of a novelist, be it from a creative perspective or a practical, professional perspective. What's something you know now you wish you knew back then when you were getting started?
Well, by far the biggest thing I wish I had known back then was to get an agent right away as soon as people start making you offers. The audiobook offer for The Martian came in before the print deal did. And I thought, the audiobook thing is not that big a deal. I didn't have an agent, I didn't know how to get one, and stuff like that. And so I read it through and signed it. Later on, when I got a print deal, at that point I got an agent. Well, it went the other way around. An agent contacted me and said, like, hey, this book's selling well, I bet you I can sell it to a publisher. And he's still my agent now, a great guy. And so he negotiated the deal with Random House and all that. But he was appalled at the wording in the contract that I'd already signed with the audiobook company, a small audiobook company out of Canada, that, well, it basically said, they own the audio rights, of course, but they also had the ability to freeze print publication.
Oh my God.
They didn't own the print rights, but they could deny you from being able to do the print rights. So we basically had to, he was like, Random House came in with this huge offer, for the book, and like David, my agent, said and he read that Podium Publishing is the name of the audiobook company. He read that contract and he said he almost threw up because he was like, oh my God, it's like, basically they can just say no, you can't do that. So what we did was, I called them up and I said like, hey, and also Fox bought the film rights right around then, and they were going to announce on this upcoming Monday that they acquired the film option on The Martian. And so this is like on a Thursday afternoon, I emailed Podium and said like, oh hey, my agent thinks that he might be able to get a book deal for me, but since he's going to go off and try to negotiate with publishers, I need the print rights to be in the clear. So can we write an addendum that puts the print rights in the clear? And they're like, well, we kind of thought we might do a limited run print on our own. We were thinking about getting into book publishing. And I'm like, yeah, but my agent says he might be able to get some, he's going to pitch it to a few publishers around. We already have an offer on the table from Random House, but he's going to pitch it around, and he needs to have those clear, those rights clear. So can I get them back from you? And they're like, well, we want you to, buy them back, I guess. And I'm like, okay, well, and they ultimately agreed to They said like, well, we want like 8% of any money you make off of print. And my agent said like, okay, that's fine, but put a cap on it, say $5,000, right? Because they kept thinking we were doing this really small, limited print run. And so they got 8% of The Martian until it sold, until that made $5,000.
We've got about 10 minutes left. Let's do some Q&A. We might not get to everyone. I would just ask you to, everyone in line, just please keep your question brief so we can get through as many people as possible. Go.
That's on now.
Yeah.
Question for Lindsey. You mentioned that you're reading a book first without taking notes. Throughout the whole process, how many times do you read a book, and how does your approach changes every time?
How many times do I read the book during the course of writing a script for it?
Yeah.
I usually try to only read it the once. And I read it really carefully, and then, as I said, I do my notes for myself of the most memorable scenes, the most memorable character moments, and what it means to me. And then, sometimes I'll go back and read a book summary as opposed to the actual book. I just feel that if you read the book too many times, you actually get lost in the weeds too much to be able to tell the story from the proper view.
Thank you. Next.
Andy, you said you wrote The Martian for 0.001% of the population. Now that's turned into a huge motion picture. How much pressure do you feel in the future to write books for either a larger audience or for film?
Good question.
I don't write them for film. I consider that, getting your book made into a movie is kind of a very lucky fluke. Everything has to line up. And so I concentrate on just writing books for books. So I don't let potential films affect my writing.
Thank you. Next.
Hi, really for the adapters, do you see yourself more as an expert in filmmaking and seeing things visually, or more reading and the literature side? Because this is great. Thank you so much for this discussion. But I'm wondering, how do you really get to that point of seeing the book? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that our skill set lies exactly at the intersection of those things. You have to be able to distill something down, and in a way, it's kind of like AP English the first few weeks, and you're finding the theme and the character and all of that, and then you have to transcend from the written word into what's in your head in terms of what would be a movie. And then you have to reverse that and then write that shit down.
I really want to get to Bail Organa and the dude, if I can. So let's have our next question. What's up?
So as writers and adapters, are there any tropes or conventions or concepts that you come across in media that you're like, I'd never write something with that, or I'd never want to adapt something with that? What are like your pet peeves when it comes to like literature and screenwriting?
So many. So many. I bet you we all have so many, so let's all just give one each, maybe? I'll do dystopian futures with semi-fascist governments and only teenagers doing weird shit can save the day. I'm done with that.
That's like half the publishing business right now.
My big pet peeve is false choices. Can I save the day, or can I save my girlfriend? It's like, well, if you just save your girlfriend and don't save the day, you don't actually save your girlfriend. So that to me is my pet peeve.
Just real quick, my biggest pet peeve is being sent material to adapt that's based on a financial imperative, not a creative imperative. They'll show you a spreadsheet, this book sold 10 million copies, but who knows whether or not. That's how we got Super Mario Brothers, the movie. There was no story there, but it sold billions of copies, so they made a movie that had no creative foundation. Next.
Since you got to ask the questions, I'll ask you a question.
Okay.
Rogue One had a lot of different elements from most Star Wars stories. The heroes were not always heroic or moral, and they all got killed in the end. Did you have Yeah. You just don't see that in all the other Star Wars stories. Did you have a hard sell selling that to the studio?
That was really all Gareth. Gareth was very attracted to the idea of doing a movie that had shades of grey, that wasn't just white hats and black hats. The idea that there were good and bad sides to the rebellion, and like there's a heroic character on the Imperial side, right? Galen Erso is an Imperial guy, but his heart is in the right place. Then you've got Saw Gerrera on the rebel side, who is certainly on the good side, but he's a militant, he's essentially a terrorist. And so we wanted to play with those shades of grey, and I think that's why people like it, because it's a more layered, nuanced movie than you might expect. Thank you.
Yeah, well done.
Bail Organa.
Sorry, Gary. We talked already. My question is for Lindsey.
Okay, go ahead.
Given
Sorry,
how
Gary.
people have reacted to season 8 of Game of Thrones with George R. R. Martin not finishing that series,
Yeah.
and Patrick still doing Doors of Stone, do you feel any pressure to do that series justice without any safe landing zone yet?
No, no pressure. It's all on him.
Dude.
Well, I abide. Dealing with like executives like mandating stupid crap like this has to be a certain way or we had to have a certain actor. How can you negotiate with them? How can you push back without completely destroying yourself?
Lindsey? Take it away, Lindsey.
I just like to think of it as there are a lot of passionate people in the business, and you don't take it personally, so you let people blow up and have their opinions and just know that the next day they may change. So, you stick as much as you can to what your vision is, and you stand up for that in a polite way, but ultimately, if there's just a huge star attached and they're the reason that people are coming to see the film, you do have to kind of listen to their perspective, and it does have valid sway. But a lot of times this whole thing is just such a collaborative process that you don't want to kill yourself, like living and dying over every little choice, because you'll drive yourself insane.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo that, I think as another screenwriter, 80% of this job is just trying not to get fired, right? And that's about learning to pick your battles. And asking yourself, is this
trying to get fired?
Right? Is this? Or so yeah, I've seen people that have deliberately sabotaged themselves to get off of a project that was killing them. But yeah, it's like pick what hill you want to die on, because you will die. If you won't do a certain note, they'll find someone who will. And it's the only writing form in the world where you can be replaced. The idea that Andy would be replaced on his next novel is farcical, but it's everyday business in Hollywood.
I've been meaning to tell you.
Oh dear. And it's almost like playing a game of Survivor. You've got to ally yourself with people who actually, as a screenwriter, you have no power. The only power you have as a screenwriter is the power to persuade people with power that you're right. And when you can't do that, you have to ally yourself with people who will fight your battles for you. I'll give you one quick example. When I was on the Book of Eli, I won't go into details, but we had a particular note from the studio that just would not go away, and it was a dumb note. And they wanted Eli to be like an ex-Navy SEAL or something. It was ridiculous. The whole point is that Eli's an everyman, and the note wouldn't go away. And Alan Hughes, the co-director, couldn't get it to go. I couldn't get it to go away. And we were eventually sitting with Denzel after he was on the movie. And he said, we did all his notes. He said, what else? We got studio notes? And I said, yeah, the studio note will not go away. And he said, what's the note? And I said, they want Eli to be a Navy SEAL. He said, that's the dumbest shit I've ever heard. I said, I know. He said, give me the phone. And he called up the studio and said, I'm not doing this note. It's ridiculous. And he put the phone and said, that note's, you'll never hear that note again. And that's because he's Denzel. Kevin Smith tells an even better version of that story, just to finish up, because we're out of time. Kevin Smith made a movie with Bruce Willis called Cop Out, and while he was directing that movie, Bruce was in negotiations for the next Die Hard film, and it was something to do with money. He wanted more of this or that, whatever, and they couldn't come to terms. And Kevin was in the room while Bruce was on the phone with the studio, and he said, "Well, I want this, I want that," and eventually they came to an impasse, and Bruce said, "Let me ask you a question. Who's your second choice to play John McClane?" And he got what he wanted. And it's sometimes that simple. But if you're going to be, and Lindsey touched on it earlier, if you're going to be a screenwriter, just understand that you will have almost no power ever, other than the power to persuade people that you're right. Am I right?
You are absolutely right, but you're also reminding me of you said we have to go. You're reminding me of a story I heard earlier this week, which was that on an early draft of Doctor Strange, that the studio came back with notes to a very large screenwriter saying that there should be more magic, less magic in it. And he just deadpan said to them, I didn't know you wanted this to be Dr. Mundane. And then I think he got fired.
Thank you.
We're out of time. Thank you so much to Lindsey and to Andy for joining us.
Thank you very much for joining us, guys. As always, appreciated. One more time, a big round of applause for Andy and Lindsey and Jeremy. If I could have everyone exit through the back of the house, if possible, I would really appreciate that.